In the spring of 1865, a farmer in central Georgia already knew what was coming before a single blue uniform reached his lane. Word traveled fast along the roads out of Macon and Milledgeville that year. Word of small detachments moving farm to farm, asking after government arms, writing names into a ledger nobody in the county had ever been asked to sign before. At Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th and 10th, 1865, Grant's terms had drawn one careful line. An officer kept his personal sidearm, his private horse, his baggage. An enlisted man stacked his musket in a pile that never left the field at all. That line held for one army on one afternoon in Virginia. It said nothing about the rifle already standing behind a farmhouse door 400 miles away, built at a state arsenal that no longer existed, by a company that had already moved 3 times ahead of Sherman's cavalry. For that gun, and for thousands like it, the reckoning came later through 1865 and 1866, and in places as late as 1867, when occupation detachments and the provisional governments replacing them went looking for arms of a distinctly military pattern still sitting in Southern hands. That was never the same matter as the black codes passed in those same years, laws written to strip freedmen of the right to carry a gun at all. A separate injustice, aimed at different people for different reasons. And this list keeps the two apart. Provisional governors moved into office across the former Confederacy that same year in Alabama, in North Carolina, in state after state, presiding over a transition from military surrender to civil government, in which arms already given up under military terms were, in more than one case, ordered deposited in a state arsenal, rather than simply destroyed on the spot. 25 guns are gathered here, and every one of them went into the ground, the wall, the water, or the chimney before the ledger ever reached the house. Number 3 carries a mechanism so rare that fewer than 20 examples are known to survive anywhere on Earth today. Number 15 came from an armory that outran 2 different Union armies just to keep building it at all. What follows is not a battlefield. It is 25 decisions made at a kitchen table in the hours or the days before a knock that may or may not have come, and the choice, each time, to bury a war, rather than hand it over. Number 25, the Cook and Brother Rifle. Ferdinand and Francis Cook were Englishmen who had opened a rifle works in New Orleans in 1861, copying the British Enfield pattern for a government that could never get enough of them. When New Orleans fell in the spring of 1862, the brothers did not close the doors. They moved the machines, the workers, and the contract itself to Athens, Georgia, and kept building a .58 caliber rifle stamped with a Confederate flag and the words Athens, Georgia. Something close to 7,000 or 8,000 came off that Georgia line before the war ended. Under a standing contract for 30,000, the factory never came close to filling. Ferdinand himself did not live to see the surrender. He was killed by a Federal sharpshooter in the fall of 1864, defending Griswoldville against Sherman's march to the sea. New Orleans production before the move had been smaller still, limited to roughly 1,000 rifles in the few months the operation had before Union gunboats reached the river. A Clark County farmer who had carried one home understood within the year that a rifle stamped with a Confederate flag was not a thing to leave leaning in a corner. He buried it under the corn crib behind the barn, wrapped in feed sacking, and refilled the crib with the season's corn within the hour. It stayed there through 2 winters before anyone thought to lift it out again. A documented Athens-marked Cook and Brother rifle today brings several $1,000s at auction, the flag stamp on the barrel worth nearly as much as the gun around it, and a rifle still fitted with its original saber bayonet climbs well past that figure. Number 24, the Confederate altered flintlock musket. Before it was Confederate, it was often nothing in particular. An old militia stock going back to the War of 1812, gathering dust in a state arsenal that had never expected to need it again. When the war came, Southern armories converted flintlocks to percussion by the thousand, using a bolster method or the so-called Belgian cone, prying off the old pan and hammer and fitting a nipple where a spark had once been struck by flint. Something on the order of 200,000 were altered across the Confederacy by 1863, an improvisation performed on guns that were already a generation obsolete when the improvising began. Federal armories in the North converted flintlocks of their own by similar methods, nearly 45,000 between 1861 and 1863, though never under quite the same urgency that drove a blockaded South to rework every old musket it could still find in a state rack. By 1865, having one of these muskets on hand was rarely thought worth defending as a prize. What was worth defending was simply not having a gun found in the house at all. So the lock was pulled free and pocketed separately. And the musket itself went under the woodpile behind the kitchen, stacked over with enough split oak that a search would have had to move a cord of wood to find it. The conversion work, not the musket itself, is what collectors pay for. A plain arsenal-altered piece, with its state markings still legible, draws a modest but genuine price from collectors today. Prized less for the gun than for the conversion work stamped into its bolster. Number 23, the Virginia Manufactory Musket. This was the oldest kind of gun on this entire list, and its Confederate service was almost an afterthought. Richmond had built its own state arms works under an act of 1797, the only such operation in the country to arm a state militia entirely with its own product. And between 1802 and roughly 1821, it turned out some 58,000 flintlock muskets, patterned after the United States Model 1795. Those muskets sat in state arsenals for 40 years, through peace and through the Mexican War, until 1862 handed them back into service. Entire divisions under Stonewall Jackson went into the Shenandoah Valley campaign still carrying flintlocks 2 generations old. The manufactory had been, in its own century, a genuine point of regional pride, the only state government in the young republic to arm its own militia entirely without leaning on a federal contract to do it. A family in that same valley, watching federal patrols move up the turnpike in 1865, sealed one inside a wall cavity of the farmhouse itself, plastered and whitewashed over within days, the gun standing upright between the studs the way a coffin stands upright in a narrow closet. An identified, dated Virginia Manufactory musket in original flint configuration sells today in the low 5 figures, valued as much for standing at the birth of American state arms making as for anything it did in 1862. A percussion-altered example, its flintlock features reworked for Confederate service, brings a comparable price for exactly the opposite reason. Number 22, the Palmetto Armory Musket. In Columbia, South Carolina, a few years before secession, William Glaze and Benjamin Flagg's private armory delivered 6,020 Model 1842 pattern percussion muskets on a state contract, each one stamped Columbia, South Carolina, 1852, and marked with a palmetto tree standing where the federal eagle would otherwise have gone. It was old stock by 1865, a musket built for a militia that had not yet dreamed of a Confederacy, carried into the war almost as an afterthought by the men who had drawn it years earlier from a state rack. By the 1850s, the pattern was already a full generation behind the rifled arms Europe had begun adopting, but South Carolina had wanted a working gun in quantity rather than a fashionable one, and the Palmetto Armory delivered exactly that. When the reckoning came, one household took the least sentimental option available, The musket was broken down into barrel, lock, and stock, and each piece went to a different relative's house in the same township, none of them holding anything that looked, by itself, like a weapon at all. The 3 pieces were not reassembled until the last federal patrol had rotated out of the district for good. A genuine, matched Palmetto Armory musket with its Palmetto stamp intact commands several $1,000s at auction today. Number 21. The Prussian Contract Musket. Not every gun the Confederacy carried came from an English stock. Agents buying abroad on credit against cotton reached past Britain into continental Europe, into gun-making towns like Soule, in Thuringia, where contractors turned out muskets on the same pattern the Union itself was separately importing through New York brokers that same year. Verify the exact volume and agent behind Confederate purchases specifically, as most surviving paperwork concerns the Union side of the same trade. What is certain is that a Soule-marked musket reaching a Confederate household by 1865 had already crossed an ocean and a blockade to get there. Union buyers were working those same Thuringian gun-making towns that same year, purchasing thousands of comparable Soule muskets through New York brokers for federal use. A reminder that both sides were drawing, by the war's second year, from the same depleted European arsenals. One household lowered its musket into the farm well on a length of rope, wrapped first in oiled leather against the water, and left it submerged below the waterline for the better part of a year before anyone thought it safe to draw it back up. Among the continental muskets that reached the South, a Soule-marked import in genuine Confederate service counts as a rarity, valued today in the low thousands of dollars. More again if the importer's paperwork happens to have survived alongside it. From an English pattern rifle stamped in Athens, Georgia, to a Belgian-built import that had already crossed an ocean and a blockade to get here, no 2 of these first houses hid the same way twice. The story moves west now, into Texas, and the pattern holds. Number 20, the French Model 1853 Mini Rifle. Caleb Hughes, the Confederacy's chief purchasing agent in Europe, generally preferred the English Enfield to anything built on the continent, and his correspondence says so plainly. But English supply was never total, and continental copies of the French pattern of 1853, built in Liège and stamped by makers such as T. Tilken, crossed the Atlantic in the same holds as the more numerous Enfields when the numbers required it. Verify the specific import volume and the vessels that carried this pattern through the blockade. A household with one of these French pattern rifles on hand chose a hiding place that asked nothing of a shovel. The rifle went inside a hollow fence post along the property line, the muzzle end plugged with a whittled cork of matching wood, so that a hand run along the rail in the dark felt nothing but timber. The pattern's distinctive long-range sight, graduated further than most Enfields carried, made it a recognizable, if uncommon, silhouette among the Confederate infantrymen who happened to draw one from a shipment. That silhouette is worth something today. A documented Confederate-run example of the French 1853 pattern brings a solid 4-figure price from collectors who specialize in continental imports specifically. Number 19, the Brunswick Rifle. Already a generation obsolete by the time the war began, the British and Belgian Brunswick, a .704 caliber rifle firing a belted ball down a 2-groove barrel, was nonetheless purchased for the Confederacy in quantity, something near 2,000 of them run through Hughes's London office. Not all of them arrived. 320 were auctioned off the captured blockade runner Stephen Hart in 1862 for $10 each, and 15 more cases went under the hammer from the Ella Warley the following year, sold to whoever in the Union prize court happened to be bidding that day. British ordnance officers had already begun retiring the Brunswick from home service by the time Hughes went shopping for it, which is precisely what made it available, and cheap to an agent working against a tightening blockade and a shrinking budget. Obsolete or not, one family held on to theirs anyway, lifting the floorboards beneath a bed to set the rifle into the joists below, and resetting the boards so precisely that a lantern search of the bedroom in 1865 turned up nothing at all. An intact, Confederate documented Brunswick rifle today draws several $1,000s. Its very obsolescence in 1861, now the thing that makes it worth finding in 1865. And worth finding still, a rifle Britain no longer wanted turned into a rifle 2 later centuries would compete to own. Number 18, the Tyler, Texas rifle. When Little Rock fell in the fall of 1863, its arsenal machinery went overland to Arkadelphia, and from there to Tyler, Texas, headquarters of a trans-Mississippi department that had by then almost no direct line back to the rest of the Confederacy at all. The Confederate States Ordnance Works at Tyler turned that salvaged machinery into an Enfield derivative rifle, Cesau-Marie Warrensomaris, chambered oddly at .54 caliber rather than the standard .577, delivering something on the order of 1,300 rifles between 1863 and the war's end. Verify the exact production count, since surviving ordnance returns disagree by a wide margin. Colonel Hill, the officer placed in charge at Tyler, had been instructed to produce rifles on both the Enfield and Austrian patterns at once, a reflection of how little the Trans-Mississippi Department could afford to specialize in only one design. A Texas household beyond the reach of any Eastern record kept its rifle inside a hollow tree at the edge of a pasture, the rotted core of the trunk packed with dry moss to keep the action from rusting through a Texas summer before anyone came looking for it at all. Paperwork is the rare thing here, not the rifle. The Trans-Mississippi's own records collapse so thoroughly at the end that an identified Tyler rifle with any provenance attached brings a premium price in the thousands whenever one surfaces today, and the odd .54 caliber chambering, once a wartime liability, is now simply another mark of authenticity. Number 17, the Mendenhall, Jones, and Gardner rifle. A Guilford County partnership of a former Greensboro mayor, a banker, and a gunsmith's son built a model 1841 Mississippi pattern rifle for the state at Jamestown, North Carolina, delivering 2,239 of them against contracts running through 1864. It was unglamorous, careful work done in a hamlet already known for gunsmithing before the war had a name. Cyrus Mendenhall's own standing as a former Greensboro mayor lent the firm a measure of local credibility that a purely commercial gunmaker might not have enjoyed in wartime North Carolina. A family near that same hamlet buried its rifle beneath the smokehouse floor, tamping the dirt back down and hanging a fresh side of pork above it that same afternoon, so that anyone stepping inside to inspect the meat found only meat. $8,000 to $12,000 is the going range today for a cataloged example with its North Carolina state markings intact, climbing further still for one that can be traced to a specific company or regiment. Number 16, the Davis and Bozeman rifle. Henry Davis and David Bozeman ran their gun works in Elmore County, Alabama, building another Mississippi pattern .58 caliber rifle for the state, delivering roughly 900 of them between October of 1863 and November of 1864, with 89 more cut down into carbines from salvaged barrels once the rifle contract itself began to wind down. Nothing wasted in an economy that could no longer afford to waste anything at all. A woman in that same county opened the ticking of a feather mattress along one seam, laid the family's Davis and Bozeman rifle inside among the down, and stitched the seam closed again before the first Federal horse had even reached the gate. A verified Davis and Bozeman rifle brings a strong 4-figure to low 5-figure price today. The rarer carbine variant sells for still more, and a rifle tied to a specific Alabama company outbids nearly everything else in the same auction room. Not every Alabama gunworks had the luxury of staying in one place. One shop, judged by collectors today to have built the finest rifle the Confederacy ever fielded, moved 4 times in 3 years, staying one step ahead of every Union column that came looking for it. Number 15, the Dixon, Nelson and Company rifle. Here is the armory that could not stay in one place long enough to be caught. It began as the Shakanoosa Arms Company at Buzzard Roost, Alabama moved to Rome, Georgia in 1862 when Union forces drew close, moved again to Adairsville under the new name Dixon, Nelson and Company, moved a third time to Macon in August of 1863 and settled at last in Dawson, Georgia in February of 1864. 4 relocations in 3 years, each one dictated by an advancing Union line, the company simply refused to be caught standing in front of. Out of that itinerant operation came something close to 3,600 Mississippi pattern rifles, widely judged by collectors today to be among the finest the Confederacy ever built. Contemporary assessments ranked the Dixon, Nelson product above nearly every other state-contracted rifle in the Western Confederacy, a reputation the firm earned while its own mailing address changed 4 times in 3 years. A family that owned one wrapped it in a quilt and pushed it behind the loose hay at the rafter line of the barn loft, the outline of the rifle never once disturbing the shape of the stack below it. Over $10,000 is the routine take today for a documented Dixon, Nelson rifle. One of the most sought Confederate long arms in existence at auction, the Dawson-era guns commanding a particular premium as the last and rarest of the company's 4 addresses. Number 14, the H.C. Lamb and Company rifle. A mile from the Mendenhall, Jones and Gardner works. In the same corner of Guilford County, Henry Clarkson Lamb's family firm built its own Model 1841 type rifle in .50 caliber, delivering roughly 700 of them against a contract that had, on paper, called for many thousands more. 2 rifle works within walking distance of each other, both drawing on the same regional tradition of North Carolina gunsmithing, both falling well short of what the state had asked for, and both mattering anyway. The firm also sold loose parts to the state arsenals at Raleigh and at Florence, so that a rifle bearing no maker's mark at all might still trace its barrel back to the same Guilford County workshop. A household nearby lowered its Lamb rifle into the cold running water of the spring house, submerged alongside the milk crocks that kept the family's food just as hidden, in the same instinct, from the same kind of casual glance. An authentic H.C. Lamb rifle today commands a price in the $8,000 range, and climbing as fewer of them come to market each year, the Type 2 variant with its Mississippi-style brass side plate, the one specialists watch for first. Number 13, the Asheville Armory rifle. The mountain town of Asheville, North Carolina, built an Enfield-style rifle whose first products the Confederate government rejected outright as substandard before taking direct control of the operation in the fall of 1862. Under government management, the plant reached about 300 rifles a month at its peak, some 900 total, before the whole operation relocated again to Columbia, South Carolina, in 1863, leaving its original Asheville building to burn in 1865. The government's decision to take the works over directly, rather than simply cancel the original contract, reflected how few alternatives the Confederacy had left by late 1862 for arming its mountain regiments at all. A mountain family kept its rifle inside a bee gum, a hollow section of log kept as a hive in the yard, the bees driven off with smoke just long enough to slide the barrel down into the dark and let the insects settle back in around it. A confirmed Asheville Armory rifle today is a 5-figure item specifically among collectors of North Carolina-made Confederate arms. Number 12, the J.P. Murray rifle. Eldridge Greenwood and William Gray bought a sword factory in Columbus, Georgia in January of 1862 and turned it toward Mississippi pattern .58 caliber rifles, hiring a skilled gunmaker named John P. Murray as master armorer and putting his name, not theirs, on the lock. Production is estimated in the hundreds to roughly 1,000 rifles overall, with 262 rifles and 62 carbines delivered to Alabama in a single 1864 contract alone. Major Humphreys, whose initials appear stamped into the barrels alongside Murray's own name, oversaw quality control for a Columbus Ordnance District that also hosted a separate sword and saber works nearby. A family along the Chattahoochee sank its Murray rifle in a mill pond behind the property, weighted with a flat stone, and marked for later recovery only by a single notch cut into a nearby fence rail. Collectors at auctions specializing in Confederate arms send an authenticated J.P. Murray rifle well into the five-figure range, and an example still paired with its matching carbine sibling draws bidders from well outside the region entirely. Number 11, the S.C. Robinson Sharps Carbine. Samuel Robinson, a transplanted Connecticut industrialist working in Richmond, built a copy of the Sharps carbine beginning in December of 1862, delivering roughly 1,900 of them before the Confederate government purchased his works outright in March of 1863 and continued the run under its own name. The distinction matters to collectors precisely because it mattered to the government at the time. A Robinson-marked carbine and a government-marked one from the very same machinery are two different objects on a shelf. The government's decision to simply purchase Robinson's factory outright, rather than continue paying him by the piece, debate mirrored what happened at Asheville and at a handful of other private Confederate works that ran short of capital before they ran short of orders. A cavalry family kept its Robinson carbine hidden under a rail fence corner. In the shallow ditch the joint of two rails naturally created, covered over with brush cut from the same fence line, so that the ground looked no different from the yard around it. An original Robinson-marked carbine, distinct from the later government production, brings a strong five-figure price today. The earliest serial numbers from that single winter of private manufacture commanding the very top of the range. Richmond had absorbed Robinson's factory outright by then, machinery and all. But not every gun to leave that city came out of a factory. Some came from a single bench worked by one man in a shop that never employed anyone else at all. Number 10. Samuel Sutherland's Altered Arms. Not every entry on this list came from a company at all. Samuel Sutherland worked alone at a bench in Richmond, converting flintlocks to percussion, boring civilian sporting rifles out to military caliber, building shotguns for the state and for the Confederacy in whatever combination the moment demanded. One recorded piece, a .50 caliber sporting rifle, shortened to a 17.5-inch barrel for cavalry use in 1861. Every piece that left his bench carried his name, and because of that, no two of them are quite alike. His ledger, where it survives at all, shows work done for private customers and for the state government in the same week. The line between civilian gunsmith and quasi-official armorer never especially firm in wartime Richmond. A Richmond household hid its Sutherland-marked rifle inside a hollow porch column at the front of the house, dropped down from a removable capital at the top, standing beside men who leaned against that same column while questioning the family, and never once suspected it. One of a kind, not one of a run. That's precisely why a documented signed Sutherland alteration draws a price in the several $1,000s range today, a signature doing for a single gunsmith's bench what a factory stamp does for an entire armory. Number 9, the Georgia Armory Rifle. Established by the Georgia legislature in December of 1861, the State Armory at Milledgeville built a rifle patterned on the United States model 1855 Harper's Ferry rifle, fitted with an older model 1841-style lock plate, until Union forces destroyed the works in the closing months of 1864. The highest known serial number on any surviving example is only 309. Not 3,000, not even 1,309. Across the entire run. Georgia's legislature had established the armory specifically because the state distrusted its ability to lean on Richmond's own overstretched Ordnance Bureau for a steady supply of rifles. A Milledgeville area family pried up the flat hearthstone of the main room, set its Georgia Armory rifle beneath it, and reset the stone so that the household's own fire, burning above the gun every evening, was the very thing that kept anyone from looking underneath it. With only a small handful known to survive anywhere, an authentic Georgia Armory rifle today is a five-figure rarity prized above nearly anything else Georgia produced. Its low serial numbers treated by specialists the way a first printing is treated by a book collector. Number 8, the Keene, Walker and Company carbine. In Danville, Virginia, a small firm built a bronze-framed breech-loading carbine, the Rarity carbine, delivering 282 of them to the Confederate Ordnance Department between May and September of 1862. At $50 each for the first 101 and $40 each after that before the company dissolved entirely the following year. Reed and Watson, a separate Danville firm converting old Hall rifles into cavalry carbines, subcontracted some of that conversion work to Keene, Walker's own shop. Two small operations in the same town quietly propping each other up. A Danville area family pressed its carbine into a baled bundle of raw cotton stored in the barn, packing the fibers back around the metal so tightly that a hand pushed into the bale. In 1865 felt nothing but cotton in every direction. Whenever a genuine Keene, Walker carbine changes hands today, it reaches well past $10,000. Only a handful of surviving examples are known to any collector, and the bronze frame itself, softer and more prone to wear than iron, has claimed a good many of the rest over the decades between. Number 7, the Clark, Sherrard and Company revolver. This one begins as an unfinished promise. Tucker, Sherrard and Company of Lancaster, Texas, held a wartime contract for 3,000 revolvers and could not finish it before raw material shortages ended the operation in 1863. The parts that remained were assembled and finished only after the war under a new name, Clark, Sherrard and Company, meaning the gun a family hid in 1865 was, in a very real sense, still half a decision away from existing as a complete revolver at all. Collectors today distinguish the handful of wartime assembled frames from the larger post-war production almost entirely by cylinder stampings, a distinction that did not exist and would not have mattered to the family that hid one beneath its own church. A rural congregation's deacon, who also happened to be a Confederate ordnance clerk, lifted a removable plank beneath his own pew and hid the unfinished revolver under the floor of the church itself in the last weeks before the surrender reached that part of Texas. A genuine wartime frame example, as distinct from the post-war assembled guns bearing the same name, today sells for tens of thousands of dollars, the premium resting on a distinction that only a metallurgist and a very patient auction house can reliably prove. Number 6, the Augusta Machine Works revolver. Built in Augusta, Georgia, on the pattern of the Colt Navy, this .36 caliber revolver is considered by many collectors the finest made handgun the Confederacy ever produced, and only about 100 were built in total. None of them carry a maker's name anywhere on the metal. The only mark left behind is a tiny assembly number or letter, hidden where the gun has to be taken apart to find it. The highest known number, no more than 48. Because no two Augusta Machine Works revolvers share a visible maker's mark, provenance today rests almost entirely on family testimony and on the tiny disassembly numbers that only a gunsmith's eye would ever think to look for. One family made the boldest choice on this entire list. The revolver went into a family grave laid inside a false compartment built into a coffin that had already been used once, in a plot nobody had any reason to disturb again for 100 years. A verified Augusta Machine Works revolver today is among the most expensive Confederate handguns in existence, commanding well over $100,000 whenever one appears at auction. Augusta was not the only southern city trying to build its own Colt Navy. A smaller shop in Memphis was attempting the same thing at a fraction of the pace and answering to a Union occupation that arrived far sooner than Augusta's ever did. Number 5. The Schneider and Glassick revolver. William Schneider and Frederick Glassick built a brass-framed .36 caliber copy of the Colt Navy in Memphis, Tennessee, at a rate historians estimate at roughly 1 gun a week, no more than 55 completed in total, before Memphis fell to Union forces in March of 1862. Only 3 or 4 authentic examples are known to survive anywhere today. Glassick had advertised the pistol in the Memphis City Directory as a weapon not inferior to the Colt's make in any particular, a claim that reads today, given how few survived to test it, almost like an epitaph. A Memphis area family buried its revolver beneath the chicken coop, where the birds themselves disturbed the ground daily so that no patch of fresh-turned dirt ever looked out of place to a passing patrol. With so few surviving, a genuine Schneider and Glassick revolver is effectively priceless on the rare occasion one reaches the market, valuations running well past 6 figures. Number 4. The T.W. Cofer revolver. Thomas Cofer built his revolver in Portsmouth, Virginia, under the 9th patent the Confederate States government ever issued on August 12, 1861, its 2-piece cylinder his own invention entirely. 82 were delivered to the Chesapeake Light Cavalry in 2 shipments in the first months of 1862 before Union forces occupied Norfolk and Portsmouth. That May and Cofer abandoned his own shop rather than stay to explain himself. That patent, the 9th ever granted by the Confederate government, predated the war's 2nd year entirely, making his revolver one of the earliest pieces of homegrown Confederate ordnance innovation, rather than merely another copy of a Northern design. One of the 82 recipients cut a section out of an attic beam of the house, hollowed it, and hinged the timber back into place so precisely that the same beam still bears the weight of that roof today. Well over $50,000 is the going price at specialist auction for a documented Cofer revolver, with its distinctive 2-piece cylinder, a figure that rises further still for one of the small number, stamped with a matching Chesapeake Light Cavalry provenance. Number 3, the Bilhars, Hall & Company Rising Breech Carbine. Candidus Bilharts, George Hall, and Coleman Bennett built a carbine at Pittsylvania Courthouse, Virginia. Unlike almost anything else the Confederacy fielded, its lever doubling as loading handle and trigger guard, its breech block rising vertically to accept a .54 caliber paper cartridge. The Confederate Ordnance Department bought roughly 100 of them in 1862 at $45 apiece before the small company ceased operating in 1864. Something around 20 are believed to survive anywhere on the planet today. Collectors who have handled surviving examples describe the rising breech action as unlike anything else fielded by either army in the war. A solution to cavalry reloading that never had the chance to be refined by a second production run. Down the chimney flue, on a length of cord, is where one family lowered theirs, resting it against the smoke shelf where no hand reaching in from the hearth below would ever find it by touch alone. At auction, a genuine Bilhars Hall carbine sells for well over $60,000 today, among the most valuable Confederate long arms in existence, a sum that would have startled the men who sold the original 100 of them to the Ordnance Department for $45 apiece. Number 2, the Virginia Manufactory Rifle. The rarer sibling of the musket already counted on this list, the Virginia Manufactory built only about 2,000 flintlock rifles across its roughly 2 decades of operation beginning in 1802, a fraction of the 58,000 muskets from the same works. By the time the Civil War called it back into service, it was already, by a wide margin, the oldest weapon pattern on this entire list. That nearly 30-to-1 ratio between muskets and rifles from the same works has always made the rifle the rarer and more valued of the 2 patterns among specialists today. A family facing the reckoning of 1865 lowered its manufactory rifle into a dry cistern beneath the kitchen floor, capping the opening again with the kitchen's own flagstone, so that the room where the household cooked its meals every day gave no sign of anything changed beneath it. An identified, dated Virginia manufactory rifle today is a five-figure item, prized as much for standing at the birth of American state arms making as for anything it did 4 generations later in Confederate hands. Number 1. The Tallahassee Carbine. This is the Confederacy's last attempt at building a carbine of its own, and it very nearly did not happen at all. Machinery hauled south from the Richmond Armory arrived at Tallahassee, Alabama through the summer of 1864, and the new works was set a production goal of 6,000 carbines a year. It never came close. That target had been set when Richmond still believed the war might last another full season. By the time carbines actually began leaving the Tallahassee line in March of 1865, the same government had less than a month left to receive them at all. Only about 500 were ever finished, in March and April of 1865, arriving too late to reach a single cavalryman still in the field before Appomattox ended the question. Fewer than 10 are known to survive anywhere on Earth today, making it, by a wide margin, the scarcest Confederate-made firearm in existence. The family that hid this one did not wait for a knock at the door at all. Word alone was enough. Days before any soldier of either army had been sighted on the road, the carbine went wrapped in oiled rags into a hole dug in the garden behind the house, and the ground was planted over that same week with the season's vegetables, so that the turned earth explained itself to anyone who happened to look. As the scarcest Confederate-made firearm known to exist, a genuine Tallahassee carbine today is valued in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. On the rare occasions collectors are ever given the chance to bid on one at all, the chimney is still standing on more than one of these properties. The barn has been rebuilt once, sometimes twice, since 1865, and the garden is still turned every spring by people who may have no idea what once passed beneath it on its way into the ground. The well has been capped. The spring house has fallen in on itself. The church still holds services most Sundays, and no one under that roof today gives any particular thought to the floor beneath the pews. Most of what went into hiding in those 2 years never came back out at all. Not because it was found, but because the man who buried it died before he told the story, or the house burned, or a fence line got cleared by a machine a century later that had no reason to dig any deeper than it already was. What ran through all 25 of these was never a single law or a single order. It was a distinction, repeated in 25 different forms. The sidearm an officer carried home under Grant's own terms in April of 1865 was never the same transaction as the rifle a family chose to wrap in cloth or rags or feed sacking and lower into the dark rather than explain. Some of these guns have since surfaced, pulled out by a plow blade or a grandchild's shovel 100 years on, wiped down, sold, cataloged, and priced. Most have not. Somewhere on one of these old properties tonight, under a floor that has been walked across for a century and a half without incident, the wood is still there, or the stone is, or the earth is, patient, undisturbed, and entirely unaware that it was ever asked to keep a secret at all.